I'm sure you've noticed the drastic changes the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air went after the third season. The kids began to grow up and become more distant from the family, while they were having another kid themselves. The show became a lot more absurd, and Aunt Vivian's actor was replaced. Now there's been answers given as to why these changes happened, especially the last one. However, they've kept secrets the real reason why these had to happen. And the reason for this is because of a lost episode that was never aired. I first heard about this when the actors were getting together at a convention and allowing some of the fans to meet and talk to them. Somebody brought up the lost episode, and everybody went dead silent. It was quite awkward. People have been told not to approach them at all when questioning this, as they will leave as soon as they can, and they will become even angry when asked about it, very uncomfortable. I, however, wanted answers, and went over to try to talk about this at another time when the actors got together. I followed the actor for Carlton when he was leaving after the event. I ran towards him, calling out his name and yelling, "Hey!" and he began to run, obviously not wanting to give away answers. I sprinted, shoving and throwing away anybody who was in the way. I eventually caught up to him in his car, and I kicked in there. And once I got in there, he seemed very nervous and scared, and I tried acting friendly, innocent, and I was like, "Hey, do you know about that lost episode in The Fresh Prince? Whatever happened to that? Do you know anything or remember anything?" And he started screaming and trembling, and he was like, "Please, I'll give it to you. I know about it. Please, just promise me you'll go away and not hurt me if you do anything." And I accepted. Clearly, he was very upset by this. I received a disc with the episode supposedly on it, and later when I got home, I put it in my computer. Now, when I got it, the screen seemed kind of weird and shaky and started freaking out a bit. However, I saw the opening credits to the episode play just as normally. Now, before I started watching this, I did hear one of them mention how before the next seasons after 3 started, they wanted the show to start reflecting what was going on in reality more, hence the addition of another kid that nobody wanted in the family and did nothing for the show. And this episode seemed to have gone full force on that before they had to make all of the other last-ditch changes. Anyway, the episode started out as you would normally expect. However, a lot of the characters just seemed kind of off. There was a very grim attitude to it, and Aunt Vivian seemed a bit more dismissive and cold towards everybody, and she was very clearly long-term into her pregnancy, most likely close to giving birth. Will seemed even more dense and stupid than he usually was, and as for Uncle Phil, well, he seemed kind of grouchy and just straight up mean. He seemed angry at everyone. Will, as usual, had some stupid scheme to get into some sort of stupid meaningless plot, and he started running around and shaking his head. He's like, "Whoa, hooty howdy hooty," and he was all like, "Hey, check this out, Uncle Phil," and he showed Uncle Phil this weird machine that he built, and he was like, "You check it out, man, this is gonna win all the ladies, I tell you." And the machine started freaking out, and it blew a hole through the garage door, destroying it, and Uncle Phil became furious and started turning red. He was like, "Well!" And he ran over at Will and grabbed him and started shaking and choking him, and the audience laughed as this happened, which was disturbing because it seemed less comedic and cartoony and more like Uncle Phil was really attacking him, and Will sincerely seemed freaked out, and all the other family members had to join up and grab Phil to get him off of Will, and once he did, Will just dropped to the floor and looked all wackily dazed and funny, as if they were still trying to play it off as just comedic slapstick, with the audience laughing more, and the others were holding him down. Everybody was there except for Aunt Vivian, and Uncle Phil was huffing, and he still seemed really red in the face and berserk, and Hillary was like, Daddy, I'm worried about you. You really need to relax. You and Mom should go on a vacation. And, like, everybody else was agreeing, and they eventually went back into the living room, and Uncle Phil sat on the couch, and he was like, I'm gonna murder that kid, and Aunt Vivian then started talking to him, and she was all like, no, honey, 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 and he's like, relax, and it's like, we can go on break, and we have a new kid coming, and Uncle Phil was like, that's right, and he started getting a berserk smile on his face. I was crazed, and he was like, I can make it the perfect kid, and we won't have to deal with anything like Will ever again, and he started laughing madly, and at this point the commercials were to come on as it went to black and cut away. Now, after that fade away, it came back, but this time it began to seem even more strange and a lot less quality. It no longer looked like a normal episode at all. The resolution was awful and very, very crusty. And there seems to almost be like this ominous red tint aura to everything. And, initially it just started out with the show coming back, and Ashley and Carlton were in the living room and kitchen just talking to each other. And Ashley asked Carlton, like, have you seen Will anywhere? And he was like, no, in fact, I haven't seen him or Dad anywhere, not ever since Dad said that he wants to kill, and then he stopped himself, and they both gasped and had a shocked reaction as the audience laughed at them coming to the realization. They then rushed around, and eventually they found what led to a secret basement in the house, and they went down it, and the scene became more red and messed up, and eventually, after going down some narrow stairs and into this big red dungeon-like area, Jeffrey was there, and he was wearing an executioner's mask and in a gimp suit, and he was like, welcome to Master Phil's torture dungeon, and he then welcomed them in and held out his arm to have them walk forward, and they began to look way too shocked, almost like they weren't even acting anymore and seeing this for real. What we saw was Uncle Phil laughing, looking maniacal, wearing his judge robe, and he was like, hello, and he sounded absolutely insane, and he insisted that they refer to him as Judge Phil, and then he showed them what he was up to, and at first you could just see the bottom of what looked like some wooden stake, and then it zoomed up, and it revealed that Will was on a giant cross, crucified. The entire lower half of his body was missing, and the audience still laughed, and he was like, "Aw, man, I tell you, Uncle Phil, this is way too far, man." And then Uncle Phil told him to shut up, Will, and Uncle Phil stuck his hand up the missing chunk of Will's missing body, and he began pulling out his intestines, and Will started to scream, the audience laughing over it, but it began to become very loud as Will was screaming more and more, and it was very frightening, and he began ripping away and pulling out his intestines more and more, and the screams began to sound way too real for it to be an act. And then they looked to the side again, and they could see Aunt Vivian in a tube, and she looked pouty angry as she was in this tube of honey and still pregnant, and Uncle Phil said how that was being tested to give himself the perfect kid, and Hillary eventually came down, and when seeing it, she got spooked and immediately ran up, and it went back up to her on the main floor of the house, but she said that this gives her a great idea, and it faded back to commercials, and then came back again with the usual outlook view of the house, and Hillary came back and she was like, this will make an excellent story for my new show, and she managed to sneak into the dungeon when nobody else was there, and she held an interview with Will and interviewed him about this, and the camera crew shot it. It eventually aired on TV there, and Uncle Phil, seeing this, became furious, and he smashed what he was holding on the ground and stomped right to there and yelled at Hillary and said he was going to destroy us, and Carlton, who at this point looked like he was lobotomized by Uncle Phil off screen, had a giant scar on his head, was speaking like he did in the first few episodes, all proper, and like, Father, I do believe something must be done about this. And Ashley was nowhere to be seen anymore. However, at this point, Carlton broke, and he got his knees and began to break character and plead. He was like, please, Daddy, please, and he mentioned how everybody outside has been calling him a sick freak, and Uncle Phil did not take this and kicked Carlton away, and then he proceeded to try to destroy Hillary. However, with this gaining more attention on TV, this brought the attention to Jazz, who welcomed himself in, and once he entered in, Judge Phil was like, what's he doing here? And Jazz began to act like his usual self and say some silly and offensive things to Phil, and Phil got furious again and charged at Jazz, who then started to run and dodge away, the audience still laughing as this happened, and eventually he got near Aunt Vivian's test tube, and he accidentally, on a scalpel, sliced his balls open, causing Jazz's semen to pour into the honey, and Uncle Phil's like, no! And this messed up everything and contaminated the batch, and Aunt Vivian's pregnant stomach began bulging and kicking around before it bursted open like an alien xenomorph giving birth in a human host. And out came not what usually came out, but instead it was Steve Urkel, and he did his usual laugh, and he was like, did I do that? And he explained how he's a lost cousin of theirs, and Judge Phil was like, I don't care, get him out of here. And he began to try to attack Urkel. However, Urkel was able to fight back, and he started to kick at Phil, and he was like, have some cheese! And he threw cheese at Judge Phil, who became angry at the resistance, and eventually a piece of cheese hit Phil in the face, causing his eyeballs to fall off, and he then looked back, however, and he had crazy-ass red swirly ones, and he was like, remember me, Urkel? When I killed your brother, I talked just like this. And Phil and Urkel began a giant battle, and it became to the point where Urkel was becoming overwhelmed, and he was like, golly, I gotta do something more about this, and he began to spin around, and in a flow of different bits of colorful cereal began to swarm around him, and he was like, with this I will finally win Laura's heart, and he blasted Urkelo's blast at Uncle Phil. Uncle Phil began resisting back at it and trying to shoot it back at him. However, Will managed to break free of the crucifixion, and Hans stood over and walked on his hands over to Uncle Phil, and he was like, "Yo, Uncle Phil!" And he jumped at Phil, interrupting what he was doing to fight back, causing both of them to be blasted by the cereal and explode. Will sacrificed himself so that they could continue to move on. It was a very bold move and idea to kill off the main character and continue the series. However, as we know, things had to have changed. It then transitioned with the normal music playing to a grave scene, and we saw the funeral of them. However, it seemed like the family members were mainly just standing around Will's grave, with Urkel and Jazz also there. Ashley and Hillary were crying and yelling like, "Why did he have to die?" And Carlton was like, "Will," and apparently it said in the script at this point that Urkel began to give a PSA to the kids about climbing into washing machines. However, the audio was too muffled and distorted and gruffled to hear it properly at all, and we then had it pan over to Uncle Phil's grave. However, it was at this point when something really strange happened. The date of his death was the actual one that happened in real life. It then started panning over to other graves of other real life people with their correct dates in the future as well. I couldn't stand watching it anymore at this point. I just got too bothered by what I saw on it. Of course, this never aired on TV, and this is the real reason why Aunt Vivian's actor left. She was just too upset by this. The other actors threatened to leave too. However, they made better budget deals with them and offered to pay them more and to completely change the show and drop this episode. They had Vivian replaced and had her have a different child. And the tone of the show became a lot more wacky, often making no sense, breaking the fourth wall, possibly to completely move away and forget about this whole incident. Now, I will tell you about what I saw that made me want to stop watching. Most of the other graves on there for people who were to die, the graves had the same date. It was December in 2012.